rush. Just it'll decant when it's ready.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Click.
Yeah. We'll make it bigger for you than
No,
that.
that's okay.
Is that okay?
Yes, completely fine.
Yeah, you're gonna read the question.
Yeah.
And ideally we'll be like, and John from so-and-so or
Good evening and welcome to the Vancouver Writers' Fest and our event featuring Wade Davis in conversation with Ian Gill. My name is Leslie Hertig and I'm the artistic director. When Wade Davis releases a new book, festival audiences flock to hear him speak about it. That's because he's passionate about the projects he delves into, and as an author and National Geographic explorer, he has plenty of fascinating stories to share. His latest book, Magdalena, A River of Dreams, is now garnering rave reviews and bestseller status. Tonight, we're coming to you live from Performance Works Theatre on Granville Island. Normally, of course, the island and this venue would be bustling with all of you, but in this strange year, we're so grateful to be able to share this conversation virtually. Thanks to our amazing behind-the-scenes staff for making this possible, and thank you for joining us. The Vancouver Writers' Fest carries out its work, including this event this evening, on the unceded and ancestral territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. We are very grateful to be here. We'd like to thank our government sponsors this evening: CMHC Granville Island, the Canada Council for the Arts, the Department of Canadian Heritage, the Government of BC, the BC Arts Council, and the City of Vancouver. We're pleased to be offering closed captioning for this event. To adjust the font size and preferences, look to the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen. Also, you can adjust how you're seeing our authors this evening by choosing to watch in either gallery or speaker view. Have a look at the top right corner of your screen so that you can adjust that to how you like it. We will be taking questions this evening using the chat function. Please feel free to submit those throughout the conversation. And now, on to our event. Ian Gill is a longtime friend of the Vancouver Writers' Fest and of our guest, Wade Davis, as well. He is a writer and filmmaker, and his columns appear regularly in the Tyee. Please welcome Ian Gill and Wade Davis.
Good evening. Hi,
Hello.
Wade.
Hey, Ian,
How are you, mate?
Great.
Good to see you again. So listen, you're the author of a great many great, indeed brilliant books. You're also a holder of a chair in Cultures and Ecosystems at Risk at UBC. And as Leslie said, you're a long-time explorer in residence at the National Geographic. Now, I have to say that holding a chair and exploring in residence seem to be somewhat static and sedentary kind of labels for a person of your peripatetic nature. But for the last few months, you actually have been held to a chair, and you've been in residence in Bowen Island because you haven't been traveling because of COVID.
Right.
So just for a minute, tell us what that's been like.
It's been marvelous in a way. I mean, obviously, we're so concerned with people who have suffered during the pandemic. But I have to say, Ian, that I haven't been in one place for this long since I was 13 years old. And yet it's been kind of wonderful. I look back on the peripatetic life I lived almost like a violent hallucination, you know. And I think a lot of us are going to...
You've had a few of those.
I've had a few of those, good and bad. But I think a lot of us are going to come out of this COVID crisis rethinking some of the madness of our lives. And we won't cease to travel, but we may not jump off to the Ball Bearing Manufacturers Association meeting in Cleveland just to speak for an hour. You know, I think things will shift.
Right. Well, and so you've been relatively content to be
part of it is I haven't been cooped up. I mean, again, I'm totally cognizant of the challenges of people who are less privileged than I am. You know, families with young kids in a small little apartment in Brooklyn or in East Vancouver. I mean, you know, we're fortunate to be on Bowen Island, on a pretty property, on a lovely island. And in that sense, you know, the transformation of communication in this new culture of Zoom has been rather astonishing to me. I mean, I get done more in one day than I ever could have done before. I can adjudicate an exam to a student in Singapore, be in touch with an editor in New York, speak to a group of people in Rio de Janeiro, and still be in my garden planting fruit trees by 1 o'clock. I mean, there's something kind of remarkable about that. Well,
the fact that Wade Davis is given an opportunity to be more productive is in many ways a very, very good thing for the world. So we're actually here to talk about your marvelous new book, not about your residence on Bowen Island, A Magdalena, River of Dreams. And we agreed earlier we might stray a bit farther than just the book. We might even talk about your Rolling Stone essay at some point. For those of you who don't know about that, those 3 of you in the world, we'll get to that. But over dinner last year, you said to me, you were finishing the book, and you said you thought this might be the best book you'd ever written. You also told me that you thought, yesterday you told me you thought this book had a kind of an embodied power and the potential for an impact that you'd never really dreamed of when you started writing the book, and in a very fraught world might be a welcome impact. So why do you think this is your best book?
Well,
and what do you think the impact is of this book that's going to redound?
Well, first of all, for that, Ian, we have to look at the history of Columbia. Columbia has not deserved its agonies. First of all, step back from that. The Rio Magdalena is a Mississippi of Columbia. It runs south to north, the length of the country. It's a corridor of commerce. It's also the fountain of culture, the source of poetry, music, prayer, literature. Columbia itself is the gift of the river. And Columbia has suffered extraordinarily. And there's a sort of cliche out there from Narcos and other, and the truth of the matter is that over the last 50 years, Colombia has been racked by violence, a war that would not have lasted a day without the profits of the cocaine trade. In a nation of 50 million people, 220,000 have been killed, 7 million internally displaced, and yet at no time have the combatants numbered more than 200,000. So the vast majority of Colombians have been caught in the vice of war, innocent victims of a war that would not have persisted for a week without the cocaine trade. Thank you.
Wade Davis unzipped.
No, but I mean, for example, at the height of the cartel, it's hard to imagine, but as the United States was spending up to $60 billion a year to try to stop the flow of cocaine in this misguided war on drugs, the Colombian Medellin cartel alone was putting 80 tons of cocaine into America every month, generating $70 million of profits every day. The accountants back in Medellin were budgeting $1,000 a week just to buy elastic bands, just to wrap the money in. In the last year before the peace was agreed to in Havana and then signed in Cartagena, the FARC, the most prominent of the leftist groups, which was down to 6,000 cadres, mostly teenagers in search of a meal, nevertheless generated $600 million from extortion and drug trafficking, mostly cocaine. Well, you give me the Shaughnessy Boy Scouts and $600 million, and I can wreak havoc in British Columbia. The truth of the matter is most Colombians have never seen, let alone used cocaine, but they've been the victims of the trade for 2 generations. And yet, despite that, they've managed to maintain their civil society and democracy, green their cities, create millions of acres of national parks, seek restitution with First Nations in a way that no nation state can match, and also pave the way for a kind of an economic and cultural renaissance, unlike anything ever seen in Latin America, as 2 generations of young people come back from exile from every capital city of the world with skill sets in every conceivable vocation. And so, one of the things I often say to Americans is that how would you feel about your war on drugs if Canada had patterns of drug consumption in bars and boardrooms across our country and laws that created the possibility of a black market trade, but enforcement that did nothing to limit the distribution of the drugs, such that 85 million Americans were driven from their homes. Well, that is what happened in Colombia. So everyone who uses cocaine and any nation that has facilitated the trade without doing anything to curtail that trade has the blood of Colombians on their hands. I mean, it's amazing, you can go to dinner in Bogota and suddenly someone will chirp up in the middle of a gay conversation, well, my father was held and killed by the FARC at the Paramo of Chigasa. And someone beside you will say, oh, my aunt was held there. She too was killed, as if they've just discovered they had people and family members who went to the same high school. That's the level of depth of the influence and the consequence of that. And yet, And yet, despite that, Colombia has maintained its democracy and discovered in this sort of marvelous moment that the one peace dividend, the one benefit of war is that while other countries were ravaging their patrimony, much of Colombia was left isolated, free of industrial development, simply because of the presence of war. And so Colombia has woken up to the fact that whereas Ecuador made decisions 50 years ago that have resulted in the absolute violation of the eastern lowland forests, the Colombian Amazon, though now imperiled, is the size of France, and it's roadless. And so Colombia is now making decisions about its future informed by 50 years of science that wasn't available a half century ago when Ecuador made those sorts of decisions. And so, you know, the genesis of this book was very kind of serendipitous. It was almost like sociology as serendipity. I would just go up and down the Cuenca, the great valley of the Magdalena, and wait around until I found someone who had something to say that the world needed to hear. And that's the essence of great storytelling. And what I found wherever I went, from whoever I spoke to, the same image, the same idea that to cleanse our soul, we must clean the river. To clean the river is to clean our soul. And that's how we started this sort of idea of sending the message to the world that while the world is falling apart, Colombia is falling together. And what better image of that than to clean up the major artery, which has been the foundation of the nation itself.
So I entered the reading of this book with a little bit of trepidation, I have to say, because what you just said, the world is falling apart, but you're coming apart, apparently. The world is falling apart, Colombia is falling together. Let's come back to that, because actually that was in 2016. The peace process seemed like this rosy moment. It's perhaps not so rosy now. But I entered the reading of this book and sort of preordained for myself that this was going to be, I came up with a phrase or an expression which I call geohagiography, because what I was concerned about was that you were so in love with Colombia that I was going to get this kind of, puff of smoke about the place. But actually, my journalistic instincts were satisfied by the fact that you went deep, you went hard. Actually, to paraphrase one of your great books, Into the Silence, and to some degree you went into the violence, if you will, and didn't shy away from that. So let's talk about that for a minute, because there was the La Violencia of the 1940s, but there was also just the narco violence of the 40 years that we've just gone through. What did that do to people? What did that do to the land? And what does it mean going forward? What did you discover, and what did Colombians discover about themselves, about that violence?
Well, one immediate impact is the psychological consequences of being a pariah nation for 2 generations. Carolina Barca, who is the Colombian ambassador to Washington, D.C., daughter of a president, former external affairs minister, was strip searched at Washington Dulles Airport simply because she was Colombian. When she gave her diplomatic credentials, the customs person barked at her with an obscenity as if echoed from the mouth of a dog. If that happens to the ambassador, imagine what happens to the ordinary Colombian citizen. I mean, the point of the book is not to gloss over the violence, but to explain it with empathy, and at the same time to reveal that this is not the story of Colombia. That Colombia, in fact, is a place of colores y cariño, the greatest biological diversity on the planet. There is no place in Colombia more than a day removed from every known ecosystem on the planet. It has more species of birds than any other country. It's a repository of biological wealth, and this has always been the definition of the country, going back to its founding with Simón Bolívar, whose great mentor was Alexander von Humboldt. It's a tortured landscape. It's one of the most difficult landscapes in the world. I mean, one of the most extraordinary things, if Lawrence Durrell said that if landscape defines character, culture springs from a spirit of place. Well, in Colombia, you know, at a time when major cities like Bogota were known as the Athens of South America, with major museums and institutions and universities, botanical gardens. Every single item in that city was carried to the city from the Magdalena on the back of a mule. You know, in 1950, you could send a bushel of coffee from Medellin to London easier and cheaper than you could send it to Bogota. So landscape has defined Colombia, and the main point really is to celebrate the poetry and the beauty and the wonder of what Colombia is. You know, often we talk about magical realism as if that was sort of Colombia's great gift to literature, you know, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, you know. But Gabo was a journalist. He was an observer all of his life.
You say in the book that magical realism is just journalism.
In Colombia, magical realism is just journalism. It's like he just happened to live in a place where heaven and earth converge on a regular basis to reveal glimpses of the divine. You know, it's in the moments in Colombia. You know, there's a great character in the book called Morita de los Manatis, and he's this sort of campesino, this sort of, you know, impoverished individual who became kind of the avatar of the manatees, and he rescued them in periods of desiccation, and he found his power in them, and that power allowed him to resist the paramilitaries, resist the guerrillas. And I was with him one day at a small little wetland where he worked with school children, and you know, he said to me, you know, we've identified 75 species of butterflies just around this little wetland. And I said, carajo, hombre, es increíble, porque es la mitad que tenemos en Canada. It's half of what we have in Canada. And then he said to me, sí, pero hermano, la cosa es que en Colombia, un mariposa es solamente un flor que puede volar. Es por eso que tenemos tanto. In Colombia, a butterfly is just a flower that knows how to fly. That's why we have so many. That's the kind of the essence of Colombia. You know, the river is also the fountain of music. Colombia is said to be the land of 1,000 rhythms. Actually, ethnomusicologists have identified 1,025. And this very night, Carlos Vivas has been given the Lifetime Achievement Award by the Latin Grammys. Well, he's an incredible rock star, but he's also a great ethnomusicologist. And I was with him on the river. He's a great friend of mine. And my daughters sung with him in front of 10,000 people. And, you know, Carlos says, all of our rhythms, porro, merengue, salsa, tambora, all come from cumbia. But the mother of cumbia is the river. The river is our music, right? So you know, the idea was to simply tell the stories. It was like a biography of the country, but it's a country unlike any other. And it's also a story about the power of books. You know, it's interesting. The genesis of this whole thing was quite serendipitous. I wrote a book about Schultes that you know well, that Canadians know well, called One River, an account of my travels as a young botanical explorer in the 1970s, with biographical chapters of my professor, who was this great Amazonian explorer, who found, like I did, his life in Colombia. And the book was translated by an incredible Colombian poet in 2002. It came out in an edition of 500 copies, and I forgot about it. I went back in 2008, and I found a student on the beach reading a frayed copy of a 4th edition I didn't even know about. I was coming out of my shower in the business class lounge in Doha, in Qatar, when my cell phone rang. It was Marta Ochoa, sister of Fabio, one of the 3 Ochoa brothers who are one half the Medellin cartel. Fabio is in federal penitentiary for life in Georgia. Marta, who was kidnapped in the streets of Medellin, and that led to Escobar creating Death to Kidnappers. Marta was there saying, could you visit my brother in penitentiary? He loves your book. It's so important to him. And it turns out that El Rio had been embraced by 2 generations of Colombians as a kind of map of dreams. It inspired generations of kids to go into biology. And it had this amazing impact. And one person who read it was the head of the biggest corporation in Colombia, Grupo Argos. And he decided for their 100th anniversary not to celebrate the company, but to celebrate the land. And so he paid for teams of botanists and journalists to go to all the 5 major regions of Colombia, the Caribbean coastal plain, the Cordillera, the Pacific Chocó, the Llanos, the plains of the east, and of course the northwest Amazon, to write illustrated books that were not to be sold but gifted to every library in the country to send a message to a new generation of kids that theirs wasn't a land of violence, theirs was a land of beauty and wonder and natural beauty. And I was asked to help promote one of those books, and after a lunch one day, I said, okay, we've done the land, let's do the rivers. And just like that, they endorsed the idea of what became 5 years of exploration of the Rio Magdalena. And the Rio Magdalena for years it was the cemetery of the nation, a slurry of the shapeless dead.
Bodies as common as driftwood.
Bodies as common as driftwood, and of course, what happened was that the leftist movements, of which there were many, ELN, which is still active, the FARC, M19, there was half a dozen of these groups, all inspired in part by real issues of social justice at the beginning, but also by the success of Castro in Cuba. And these movements would have fizzled out if they hadn't been funded by the cocaine. And because of that, they could strike anywhere. And because the federal state and the military was historically weak, initially with just 114,000 men in the army, they couldn't guarantee the security of the ranchers. They couldn't guarantee the security of the wealthy landowners anywhere. And because the FARC could be anywhere, the paramilitaries also had to be everywhere, but they couldn't be everywhere, but terror could be. So 80% of the killings were done by these paramilitaries, which initially began to try to just protect the interests of the wealthy. And that's what created the terror, right? You wrap people around a tree and cut them up with a chainsaw, word spreads, right? And the paracos, the paramilitary, told anyone that if we put a body into the river, don't touch it or you'll be with it, right? And the idea was to kill people twice, a physical death, but a spiritual death, because without final rites, you couldn't transcend purgatory and get to the side of God. But one community of fishermen at Puerto Berreo, where the currents gathered the dead, said, no, we're not going to do this. And one by one, they said, we're going to take the bodies. And the bodies became known as the no nombres, without name. In Latin, in English, in Spanish, N-A-N-A, those without names. They didn't just take them out of the river, they carried them reverently to the graveyard. And then they baptized them with the names of their own disappeared ones, bringing them into the lineage of the family. And that was an extraordinary act of heroism and catharsis that defied the paramilitaries and allowed the people of Puerto Berreo to say, the river brought you to us, and we are here, and we will not leave you alone. I mean, Colombia is so full of those gestures. I mean, look at you alluded to the delicacy of the peace process. It's worth reviewing with people what happened. Until the one foreign intervention the Americans have ever done in my lifetime that probably was useful was Plan Colombia. It only happened because there had been this schism between the DEA and the CIA. The CIA were chasing Cold War ghosts. The DEA was dealing with drugs. And they were completely antagonistic, right? And then suddenly someone realized that the two things were related, and the term narco-terrorism began, right? And then the floodgates of foreign aid opened until the point where Colombia was the third largest recipient of foreign aid, U.S. foreign aid in the world. And that did allow the army to become professionalized. And
1 second, we need to do something with your audio, apparently. Sorry about that. A costume failure. I think that's what it's referred to in the popular media, isn't it?
Sorry, everybody, about that. These things happen. And so once that had that came together, in 2002, Alvaro Uribe was elected as a sort of a hardliner, right? And he did sort of the equivalent of Nixon going to China. He demilitarized the paramilitaries, and only he could have done it because he was affiliated with the right wing. And of course, it was easy terms. They had to be easy terms. They weren't going to just walk into a jail cell.
Right.
And then his defense minister became president, Juan Manuel Santos, and devoted his entire life to peace. And he made the deal with the FARC doing the same thing, lenient terms, because they weren't going to walk out of the forest into a jail cell.
Well, South Africa.
He then put this to
all over
referendum
again.
when he didn't have to, and the referendum narrowly, very narrowly failed. He then pushed it through the Congress, which he legally was able to do, but that led the right to be able to nominate an acolyte of Uribe, Ivan Duque, split a divided field on the left, becomes president because Santos can no longer, he can't be constitutionally a second term. Duque is lukewarm to the peace process. Meanwhile, the FARC has abandoned huge areas of Colombia, and into that void, the federal government doesn't go, but the disaffected FARC go, the bandidos go, the cocaine people go. And even though homicide rates dropped within a year of the peace agreement to levels not seen in years since 1975, the whole effort of the peace agreement, which had multiple clauses, implementation of which was going to be $45 billion, oil prices dropped just when Colombia has to deal with the biggest humanitarian crisis in the history of Latin America, which is the Venezuelan refugees coming in. And unlike the Americans, who turn away families, cage children, shut their borders, the Colombians, to their enormous credit, absorbed 1.8 million Venezuelan refugees, housed them, fed them, schooled them, gave them medical care. And so the whole peace process has become delicate because of all this. It will never end. The Colombians are exhausted by war. But one of the thoughts of this book is that the biggest enemy of peace is despair, negativity, disappointment, and pessimism. And this book, by acknowledging what happened, explaining it with empathy, at the same time holding the mirror to all that is so glorious and wondrous and amazing in the most incredible of countries in Latin America, it will send a message to the nation that there's still hope. That the best endorsement of this book comes from a friend of mine, Hector Abad, one of Colombia's great writers, a great journalist. But the murder of Hector's father, who was a progressive physician, not a politician, was one of the handful of assassinations that truly shook the country. And Hector became both in exile in Italy because of that, but also became famously embittered with an almost a public love-hate relationship with his country. And on the back of this book, he writes, "Only Wade could make me love Colombia again." And that's the power of the book. The book is a love letter, as he wrote, to Colombia.
Right. So there's another form of violence, of course, which is not exclusive to Colombia, which is violence against nature. And you quote an Arhuaco elder, Mamo Camion, who says, "Peace will not matter if it's only an excuse for various sides of the conflict to maintain a war against nature. The time has come to make peace with the natural world." And to some degree, that's as much, if not more, about what this book is about than the history we've just gone through.
The story of that is, this story doesn't actually get into the book, but it exemplifies the wonder of Colombia. You know, first of all, Mamo Camillo is a sun priest of the Arhuacos, and 500 years after the conquest, there's a group of indigenous people known as the Elder Brothers, 4 independent societies, Concuano, Arhuaco, Kogi, and Wiwa, all speaking Chibchan languages, but mutually unintelligible, all of them descendants of the ancient Tairona civilization, which carpeted the Caribbean coastal plain of Colombia at the time of the conquest. In a blood-stained continent, these people who were treated in this isolated volcanic massif that soars higher than any coastal mountain range on Earth, the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, which is for them the heart of the world, but it is the heart of the world because every known ecological niche in the world is in that mountain. And they remain to this day ruled by a ritual priesthood. But the training for the priesthood involves austerities in the extreme. The acolytes are taken away from their families, sequestered in a shadowy world of darkness for 18 years, during which time they learn the Baroque religiosity of the belief system, which includes the idea, literal idea, that their prayers and rituals maintain the cosmic balance of the world. And then at the end of this initiation, the acolyte is taken on a journey to the heart of the world, from the ocean to the ice, from the ice to the ocean, where suddenly he sees the beauty of nature, and everything is learned in the abstract is affirmed. And to think that 500 years after Columbus, these sun priests are still in those mountains, still staring down at the sand beaches where Columbus's men landed on the third journey in the late 15th century, still here to inform us. So I've known Mama Camille for years. I first was in the Sierra working there in the 1970s. And I heard that they periodically did ritual payments at the mouth of the Magdalena, which is beyond their traditional territory. But it reflects the fact that the Magdalena feeds all the streams that flow into the Ciénaga Grande de Santa Marta, the biggest wetland in Colombia, which is this great inland sea that shines like a mirror to the heavens. And the mountains are right above that with the snow falling into, you know, everything's connected. And I went to see him, and that's when he told me, he said, La paz no vale nada si es solamente una manera en que los varios lados pueden unificarse para mantener una guerra contra la naturaleza, right? Tenemos que crear paz con todo. So then we went over to make a ritual payment. You know how it goes. You've done this a million times. I hired a bus. We had 26 men, women, and children. It was a big party. We roar over to Barranquilla and do this great ritual payment. And two things happened en route. First of all, they told me that traditionally the Mamos made pilgrimages not just to the river mouth, but to the source, walking 1,000 miles or more, measuring the relationship between a people on the borders of the river with their relationship to the river. They say that the consciousness of the people is a direct reflection of their treatment of the river. And secondly, he told me that President Juan Manuel Santos was visiting their community in Namasimaque in 4 days, and could I be there to help welcome him? Well, first of all, I was intrigued by the first thought, that the idea that the blood in our veins is no different than the water in a river. And that's true, the hydrological cycle of which we are all part of. When you die, Ian, when I die, our blood will flow as effortlessly to the sea as the water in a river to the ocean. But then, how could I help them in Namasimaque? So I made some phone calls. Word came back, and this can only happen in Colombia. The president of Colombia, a Nobel laureate for peace, sends a message back, I'd be happy to have Profi Davis come along. I then fly from Barranquilla to Bogota, jump on the jet, and on the way north, the aides to the president are peppering him with statistics about what he should say in his speech that will go out to the nation. And I sheepishly put up my hand and I say in Spanish, I quote Mama Camille, statistics mean nothing, it's what's in your heart. He makes that theme the essence of his talk. And then when we're in the men's sacred temple with the formal gift exchange, he introduces his invitados, you know, his ministers, and he gets around to me and he's very gracious. This is the man who, after all, would make me an honorary citizen of the country. And in the middle of his generous remarks about me, one of the Mamos interrupts him and said, no, Presidente, you don't have to tell us about that guy. He's our ambassador in Washington, D.C., for God's sake. And that was true. And then we had a big laugh about that, and then we flew back to the Blackhawks. We flew back down to Bogota. I was able to jump on a plane, get back to Barranquilla on the first night of Carnival, just in time to watch my daughter on stage with Carlos Vivas in front of 10,000 people, the two of them singing her anthem to the Magdalena. I had asked her to write a song about the river, and she wrote this amazing. So there I am as a father, listening to my daughter with notes that you normally hear in the heart of forests. And then I'm so proud. But the next day dawns, and I fly back to Medellin. And word comes that ex-presidente Alvaro Uribe, the great rival of Santos, would like to see me. And I then roar up the roads up to Rio Negro, and my friends are calling me and saying, look, there's going to be 1 million people there. It's a big fiesta. Just try to get to the president and get in a word edgewise about our dream of cleaning up the Magdalena as a symbol of peace. And I get there, I go through security, roll down to the hacienda. There's one solitary figure at the front door. It's the much admired and beloved wife of Alvaro, Lina Moreno. And Mrs. Moreno, the wife of the ex-president, welcomes me, walking through her living room. She says, Profi, have you had lunch yet? I said, no. I'm kind of like, no. And then I have a little lunch, with the ex-president Uribe, and he takes me all over the country. He knows every single crossroads, but I do too. And then he said, okay, Profi, it's time. And we go to have coffee to talk about the Magdalena. And then I show him a PowerPoint, and he sees a picture of Santos, and he, because they're blood rivals. And then he thanks me for loving Colombia, and I thank him for making the peace. And I said to him, history will show that it took 2 men to make the conditions possible for peace. And that was a chance to say that to those 2 men in a marvelous 72 hours in Colombia. And that's what Colombia is like. Magic happens, the world comes into reassuring focus through the lens of the phantasmagoric. Anything is possible. Poetry is a daily occurrence. River stones really are the eggs of dinosaurs.
So I want to do a little word association game here for a second, to go back to some of your books. One river that you've referred to before, Richard Evans Schultes, Into the Silence, obviously George Mallory, Magdalena, Alexander von Humboldt. I love your exploration of von Humboldt, or Humboldt's contribution to not just exploration, because exploration is a pretty freighted idea these days, but understanding. And what a magnificent person.
Well, Colombia is the only country born out of the vision of natural history. And one of the characters, one of my closest friends, is William Vargas, who is a botanist who was raised in a town so poor he could not afford shoes. But by the time he was in grade 3, he was known as El Sabio Caldas. Caldas was a self-taught scientist who befriended Humboldt and traveled with Humboldt across Gran Colombia in the first years of the 19th century. And my friend William, in the same way that a child of the coast could rise to the highest levels of literature in the case of Gabo, young men inspired by the beauty, and women inspired by the beauty of Colombia, have risen against incredible odds to the highest levels of science, in part because Colombia has the best university system in Latin America. But, when you think of a botanist, it's hard to explain those who aren't botanists. But, for a botanist in North America, in Canada, to discover a new species would require an act of God, practically. Whereas people like William are discovering them on a daily basis. So rich and so unknown is the flora. And people like William Vargas are the direct descendants of Humboldt. They're the descendants of Simon Bolivar. Humboldt spoke about nature often in metaphor, but Simon Bolivar, who's befriended by Humboldt in Paris, was enchanted by 2 men, Napoleon and Humboldt. And as he liberated areas of land that Washington could never even have found himself in, I mean, you could take all the lands that George Washington liberated, throw them into the lands that Bolivar liberated, and the Americans would never find them, right? I mean, Bolivar liberated a continent, and he did so with this vision of natural history. And part of that was because the colonial powers were very different. Canada was a mercantile system. The French came for the beaver and the cod. was a fashion statement that created any kind of economy here. As John Ralston Saul says, we weren't settlers, we were merchants. We didn't set out to destroy the indigenous people, not that we were nice to them, but at least we married them and moved up in the world. In the United States, the 13 colonies were settled by those who didn't come over for religious freedom, but to practice their own breeds of religious intolerance. The Spanish colonial presence in the Americas was mercenary, extractive, violently vicious from the beginning. I mean, the stipulations, people born in the colonies could not own various businesses. They couldn't have a printing press. They couldn't be educated, right? And so there was this lingering hatred in Bolivar for the Spanish, and it came down to how they treated the land. And so his entire revolutionary zeal was caught up in the idea that our landscape is the essence of who we are. To destroy and reduce to rivers of blood the Spanish is not simply to seek our personal freedom, but to liberate the land. And that whole wonderful idea that, landscape defines character, culture springs from a spirit of place. From the very beginning, Colombia was born in the vision of a natural historian. Simón Bolívar had plans to plant millions of trees. He had incredible sanctions for those who cut the forest. And so part of what we came to in this book was, why don't we clean up the river? But not as an environmental issue, but as a symbol of patriotism. Everybody, from every fisherman to every musician to every politician, said to clean up our soul, we must clean up the river. That's the image of the corpses with gallinazos encima, vultures on top, pecking at the flesh. That's the image of darkness in Colombia. But through all those years, even as it became the nation's graveyard, the Magdalena remained a river of life. And at the end of the book, characters in this book had to fight their way into the book. There were so many amazing characters. Every character represents something in the Colombian experience. And Sandra Uribe, who was my closest friend, who helped edit the book, research the book, was also a character in the book. She was a scion of a wealthy family in Medellin at a time when she, as a young girl, could not distinguish the sound of thunder from the sound of bombs, was sent to exile in Miami, where she was made fun of for being from the land of Escobar by teenagers in high schools in Miami whose main social activity was searching for illicit drugs, cocaine being there, snorting cocaine. And at the end of the book, Sandra says something really wonderful, that the very name of the river Magdalena is from Maria Magdalena, because it was her birthday when the Spaniards first sailed across the Bocas de Ceniza, the mouth of ashes, the river mouth. And in the 6th century, Pope Gregory defined Maria Magdalena to be a prostitute, a woman of the night, who only Christ's grace allowed her to wash his feet with her tears. But it turns out that he was wrong, and that for 15 centuries, the Catholic Church focused on the wrong Maria. It was Mary of Bethany who was a repentant prostitute. Maria Magdalena was a beloved disciple of Christ, who was with him in life, at his death, the first to witness his resurrection. She was the one that he said, take this joyous news of my resurrection to the world. She was always the apostle of the apostles, the purest one. And it was only in 1969 that the Catholic Church removed the scarlet letter of sin from her breast. And only in 2016 did Pope Francis make her the apostle of the apostles.
She was
Maria
restored.
Magdalena, Magdala in Aramaic, the watchtower, the spiritual watchtower of Christendom. That's who she really was.
And she was restored.
Restored in 2 years, such that for 3 billion Catholic, Lutheran, Anglican, and Eastern Orthodox, she's now a saint. And Sandra mentioned that to me as we sat at a cafe in the mountains above Bogota, looking to the west and the great volcanoes of the Central Cordillera. And she said to me, why can't we do the same thing for the river? And at that moment, a small yellow bird landed on our table, pecked at the crumbs, and disappeared in the cloud forest.
So I don't know if he's your hero, Humboldt.
Yeah.
You write about him as a storyteller. He strode the stage with a unique charisma, addressing audiences that included aristocrats and royals, but also students and servants, soldiers and bricklayers, infusing his prose with poetic flourishes certain to fire the hearts of his readers. It sort of sounds like somebody I know. You stride that stage.
We used to drive Napoleon pink with rage. You know, Josephine would say and acknowledge that Humboldt was more famous than Napoleon. And Napoleon would say, how can a collector of birds be more powerful and charismatic than a collector of nations? But the truth is, Humboldt was. He was the first true international celebrity. I mean, he created the field of science as we know it. There would have been no Charles Darwin without Alexander von Humboldt. But the critical thing about him is he wasn't just a great naturalist, the man who created the notion of biogeography, the one who, with Bonpland, made all these extraordinary collections, but he was also in the great spirit of the Enlightenment. He was a multifaceted social reformer. You know, he railed against slavery. He was flamboyantly gay. You know, I mean, poor Caldas from the small provincial town of Popayan travels across Colombia and Ecuador to Quito, and he's just had it. I mean, you know, he's a serious scientist, and Humboldt's his god, and yet he can't bear the thought that Humboldt has so much fun and is so licentious. But, you know, Humboldt was simply exploding with all the dreams of the Enlightenment.
Well, and enormously prescient, as you say in your book as well. Because
Totally.
you say the prescience almost inconceivable for the time. He connected colonialism to environmental destruction or devastation, slavery to power, economics and politics, the exploitation of natural resources to the violation of tribal peoples, and climate, soils and agriculture, the demographics, monoculture and distorted distribution of land. These are things that not just Colombia is wrestling with now, Canada is wrestling with now, the world is wrestling with these.
It's really interesting to ask ourselves how social change happens. You know, how does a man like Humboldt come along and anticipate all those things that we now take for granted? You know, I often say to young people, consider the values of your great-grandfather in the Edwardian era, their certitudes about race, about the position of men and women in a family, about the exploitation of the natural world. There's not a single certitude of that era that we would accept today, and in fact, many of them we would find morally reprehensible. As recently as 1911, the Oxford English Dictionary did not have an entry for what we would call racism, colonialism, homosexuality. And when we think of who we are today, in a generation in which women have gone from the kitchen to the boardroom, people of color from the woodshed to the White House, gay people from the closet to the altar, we think of social change as being a kind of a progression of movements, of resistance, and it is all of that. But at some point, someone has to shatter the certitudes that had ground down people for so long. And all of those movements I just referred to never could have happened had it not been for a group of contrarians in the early days of American anthropology, led by Franz Boas, Margaret Mead, Ruth Benedict, Zora Neale Hurston, who had the audacity to say race is a cultural construct. The audacity to say that, you know, manners don't make the man, men and women invent the manners. The audacity to say the other peoples of the world aren't failed attempts at being us. You know, that the audacity to say that every culture is something to say each deserves to be heard. The audacity to say that the evolutionary idea that we went from the savage to the barbarian to the civilized at the Strand of London is not only ridiculous, it's morally abhorrent. All of that came out of a crystalline moment of thought around the Museum of Natural History in the 1920s. And that's why Franz Boas ranks with Darwin and Einstein and Freud as the four great pillars of modern thought. And that's what Humboldt was doing. You know, the idea that, you know, we talk about the great men in history theory, but it's possible that individual men and women can have a constellation of ideas that have an inherent charisma and authenticity that allows them to break out of orthodoxy in a way that changes history. And that's clearly what Humboldt represented, right, on every front.
So let's talk about anthropology as activism for about 3 or 4 minutes, and then we're going to take questions from the audience. But it does bring us to the Rolling Stone. August the 6th this year, you published an article. It got 5 million readers. It got going on for 400 million media impressions. I don't actually know what that is, but it sounds impressive.
It sounds impressive.
Yeah, very impressive, 400 million impressions. And you in Magdalena, you wrote about, you write about the fact that great chieftains and empires rose and fell in the Americas, 2,000 years before Columbus came along and everything else. In your Rolling Stone article, The Unraveling of America, you basically pick up on that theme and basically say America is unraveling. It was an enormously controversial article, and you've been, and you referenced COVID pretty heavily about in this time of pestilence, this people dying, everything, a government that's irresponsible and everything else, that this is we're presaging a sort of failed state.
It really wasn't controversial. I mean, the reason it went viral because it wasn't controversial.
Well, it was controversial with some anthropologists, let's face it, who didn't like your activism.
I mean, anthropologists don't like activism of any sort.
Generally.
I mean, the thing that made that article, or at least why I wrote it, was it didn't see COVID as a medical issue, but as a cultural issue.
Right.
And it struck me that a lot of what we were talking about is the changes that COVID would bring about in terms of the nature of the workplace, whether we'd go to movies again or sporting events, would they be streamed into the home? Those all seem to me rather ephemeral issues that would be readily dealt with. I mean, people are always dancing with new possibilities of life, and change is the one constant. But it seemed to me that the one real key consequence of COVID was the unraveling of the American myth of exceptionalism, and that millions of Americans woke up to find themselves living in a failed state, led by a dysfunctional government at the head of which was a buffoon who was advocating the use of disinfectants for treating a pandemic disease that intellectually he couldn't begin to understand. And, empires do come and go. The British Empire reached its greatest geographic extent in 1935. People were swirling gin and tonics all over the world, having no idea that the floor had fallen out from beneath them, certainly by the end of the Great War. And the key thing is that, the response of America to COVID signaled something much deeper about the failure of the American state. If you trace the history where the nation goes into World War II, demilitarized, 1940, Bulgaria and Portugal have bigger armies. And then suddenly within 3 years, 18 million men and women are in uniforms. The industrial might save civilization. It really does become the arsenal of democracy. Ian, for every 5 pounds of supplies the Japanese Empire of the Sun got to a frontline troop, America got 2 tons. The Ford Motor Company produced more industrial output than Italy. We were spitting out Liberty ships by the hour. The record start to finish was 4 days, 29 hours, 17 minutes. The Chrysler's Detroit Arsenal plant produced more tanks than the entire German Third Reich. We, without thinking, sent 500,000 trucks to the Russians. The Russian soldiers' blood beat the Nazis, but they marched into Berlin on boots made in Pittsburgh. Altogether, 14 million pairs, 35 million uniforms. And in the wake of the war with Europe in ashes, America controlled half the world's economy, made 90% of the world's automobiles, and that affluence allowed a truce between labor and capital that gave us the middle class, gave us the weekend, whereby a man with limited education could support a family, buy a house, buy a car, send his kids to good schools.
And now?
And that all disappeared in 2 generations of globalization, which any working man could see as just capital in pursuit of cheap labor. And in the wake of the war, we never stood down. We have troops today in 170 countries. And the cult of the individual began to erode the notion of community to the point where by 1960s, half of marriages were ending in divorce. Only 6% of American homes were having grandparents and grandchildren beneath the same roof. The cult of work left children alone such that the average American youth by 18 spends 3 years in front of a screen, contributing to an obesity epidemic so severe that the Joint Chiefs call it a national security crisis. The largest source of mortality of Americans beneath 50 is opiate addiction. The Americans consume 2/3 of the world's antidepressant drugs. I mean, you can go on and on and on. And the society almost lost the sense of community, let alone society. And so when you have people flocking to the beaches, ignoring medical advice, they're not exercising freedom. They're revealing the weakness of people that lack the stoicism to endure the epidemic or the fortitude to defeat it. When 62 million Americans decide, fully cognizant of the limitations of a Donald Trump, to nevertheless cast their vote in favor of their own personal grievances, their own sense of self, that's a pure sign of decadence, because a democracy on the way up does not allow the frivolous expenditure of a vote. When you build a wall across the southern frontier with Mexico, that's not just a vainglorious effort, it's an act of treason, because you're denying and defying the essence of your country. Treason isn't just when a country, when an individual trades state secrets to the enemy. It's when you do things that betray the myth of your own country, because myths aren't old stories, they're moral charters, right? And so the point I was trying to make is that no country anticipates its demise, but the 15th century belonged to Portugal, the 16th to Spain, the 17th to the Dutch, the 18th to the French, the 19th to the British, the 20th. Every 3 years, China pours more cement than America poured in the entire 20th century. Since 1975, the Chinese have never been at war. The Americans have never been at peace. You know, you compare COVID rates in Canada and the United States. July 30th, as they announce 59,000 cases, we have 5 cases in all of our hospitals. So what's going on? What's going on here is that Canadians still have faith in our institutions. We don't measure wealth by the currency accumulated by the lucky few, but rather by the strength of social relations and the bonds of reciprocity that link us all in common purpose. We have a healthcare system that favors and focuses on the collective, not the individual, and certainly not the private investor who views every hospital bed as if a rental property. You know, I use the analogy, not that Canada's perfect, because you were talking about criticism of the article. The main criticisms came from Canadians who said I was puffing up our own country too much. That's not what I was doing. And I was certainly not anti-American in that piece either. It's a love letter to the country. It's like an intervention. But at the same time, you know, think of the difference in Canada and the United States when you go get your groceries. You get your groceries in America, and there's a social, economic, racial, educational chasm between you and the checkout person that's not bridgeable, or impossible, or difficult to bridge. And you don't feel that in Canada. It doesn't mean that you're necessarily interact as peers. It doesn't mean that you have more or less affluence or more or less education than the clerk at the till, but you do feel a sense of common purpose. And the reason for that is simple. You know that they are getting a decent wage because of the unions, and you know that your kids probably go to the same public schools that aren't funded by property taxes that favor the affluent kids, but by grants that give every kid an equal chance. And third and most important, they know that you know that if their kids get sick, they get the same care that your kids get. Universal health care is not about medicine. It's about solidarity. It's about sending a message that everybody counts. And there's an anecdote that does not get into the article that is perhaps the most poignant of all, which is the one morning when my mom was 85 years old, living alone in an apartment in Victoria. She got a headache at 11 o'clock in the morning. And by 2 o'clock, she was being prepped for neurosurgery. She had an aneurysm. Her life was saved by an immigrant, an Indo-Canadian neurosurgeon of great genius. As we went to see her in the intensive care unit, there was another family beside us with a young girl from Manitoba, a Mennonite family, surrounded by 1 million people, right? And that girl, by chance, had the same affliction, saved by the same doctor, the same afternoon, with the same intervention. Now, my sister and I were thinking about that because we could have paid for that service. She's a lawyer, I've done well. That family would have had a choice between the well-being of the family and the health of the daughter in the United States. And we in Canada, as in any social democracy, that's not a choice that any family should have to make or confront in a civilized country. Now, at that time, the Empress Hotel had a policy that any Canadian with a relative in an intensive care unit at any Victoria hospital got a free room. So we all poured out of the ICU back to the old Bengal bar in the Empress Hotel. Like that's what it was called. And of course, the Mennonites don't drink, so I bought them, I don't know, Cokes or sodas or whatever they wanted. And my sister had a glass of wine and I had a beer. And then we did a toast. We didn't toast the survival of our loved ones, although that was much on our minds. We didn't toast the incredible neurosurgeon who came to Canada and ended up saving the lives of these 2 women, one on the edge of, and one a child. And we didn't toast each other. We toasted our country, because it was our country that made that moment possible. Taking 2 families from the opposite side of the educational, social, religious, geographical spectrum of our land and brought us together in one single heart, grateful for the survival of our loved ones. And that is the essence to me of Canadian patriotism, not flag-wrapped chauvinistic cant. It's the subtle rhythms of love, gratitude, consilience, and community.
Not the we movement.
What?
No, not the we movement.
No.
And actually, and it is love of country, love of Canada in the case you've been talking about, love of Colombia in the case of your book, that actually does offer hope. Your book is not about Canada, it's about Colombia.
No, but
it's infused with this notion.
I mean, the importance of this book is that, as when President Santos tweeted out last week, every Colombian should read this book, and it's doing very well in English in Colombia, because the whole point of the book, I mean, it wasn't really by design, but by effect. The book wouldn't have any power if it had ignored the violence. It deals with it in great graphic detail.
Geohagiography.
Yeah, right, exactly. But it does so with empathy and explanation. And it suggests, above all, that those ultimately responsible for Colombia's agonies are everyone you've ever known who's used illicit cocaine and every government that's facilitated that trade. At the same time, it shows the wonder of Colombia with great empathy. And my hope is that it'll be like a mirror, because the enemy of peace, what makes the process so precarious, is pessimism, despair, negativity. And you can understand that after 2 generations of being treated as a pariah nation. But by holding a mirror, it is analogous a little bit to the Rolling Stone piece. In the Rolling Stone piece, I wasn't an anti-American thing. I became an American. I married an American. My kids are dual citizenship. My father-in-law was almost president of the United States. My son-in-law is on active duty as an American military officer right now. I love the United States. My career could never have happened in Canada. But I want America to be once again the land of Abraham Lincoln, Walt Whitman, the Grateful Dead, and maybe it just will be. But that book, that article was putting a mirror to America saying, this is where you've fallen. And that's the first act of intervention, is to show a loved one how far they've fallen. That's the first step in the path of rehabilitation. Right. In this case, it's more like saying to Colombia, don't despair. Think how incredible you really are. You know how incredible you are. You are not a land of violence. You are not a land of murder. You're not a land of cocaine. You're a land of colores y cariño, where it's the very spirit of the people that has allowed you to endure agonies that a weaker people might well not have been able to bear. And so in that sense, one hopes that this will be a mirror of hope that will catalyze new dreams of peace in Colombia.
So we have a couple of minutes for questions, and I'm glad we brought us back to your book, because the questions I think you're going to start about your book. There's one from Penelope. Wade, can you tell us to what degree executions of Indigenous and environmental activists is being addressed by the Colombian
Yeah,
government?
that's a very important question. You know, as I said, homicide rates in the country collapsed in the wake of the peace agreement to levels not seen since the 70s. But in all these regional areas that were abandoned by the FARC when they laid down their arms, the federal government, in part for lack of intention, in part for lack of resources, did not occupy those areas. At the same time, civil society, which for years had just bowed to the ground, hoping that the madness would go away, was suddenly saying, wait a minute, what about the stipulations of the peace agreement? And to the credit, in a sense, of the FARC, the peace agreement was all about social development. It was all about infrastructure, potable water, schools, medical care. And civil society said, wait a minute, what about the promises of that? And because the federal state wasn't there, either financially or militarily, to secure the peace and guarantee those promises, but who was there were the FARC and the cartels and the more cocaine being created than ever before. Those people had no interest in the federal state being present. They didn't want civil society, and they started to kill these individuals. So the terrible thing is that since the peace agreement, you know, a great number, 700 or more at least, civic leaders have been killed. And frankly, the federal government has been incredibly flaccid. You know, one can only question what would have happened if President Santos had not been limited by the Constitution to a single term. The glory of the Nobel Peace Prize, the euphoria of the peace agreement, he could have readily, with his intention and will, secured huge amounts of foreign aid from the European and the North American community to implement the peace agreement, particularly by reminding everyone that Colombia was also dealing with the consequences of the breakdown of Venezuela.
Right.
The problem in my mind is that there's been a vacuum at the heart of the process, because Duque, although he's not the pawn that people on the left dismiss him of completely, he's nevertheless in the camp of Uribe, and Uribe has not, bless him, been able to bury his bitterness, right? And that is why there's a line in the book that says, you know, anyone who gets in the way of peace will have the harsh judgment of history. And that is my comment about Uribe.
Right.
And because of that, a tremendous opportunity has been lost. And it doesn't mean that peace is going to disappear. I think it's a little bit like Ireland or South Africa. You know, nation states, at the end of long periods of civil strife like this, they always find peace through pure exhaustion, when the people themselves say, enough, we're not going to put up with this.
Right.
And there's no question Colombia is still in that space.
Well, Mary Robinson talking about, we talked until people got talked out.
Yeah, you know, and I think Colombia will never go back to the open marauding violence of the last 50 years, but the pure potential of peace is more precarious than it should be, in part because it will never have peace without the cleansing stroke of legalization of cocaine.
Right.
On Friday of this week, I'll be testifying in the Colombian Senate about an initiative to legalize coca leaves to at least give the campesinos a legal market for their produce.
By Zoom.
By Zoom.
Yeah.
By Zoom.
We have another question from Candace. You've spoken about the immense beneficial impact that your book will have on the Colombian people. I'm wondering if you've worked with any current Colombian activists who've influenced you and enabled you to speak on behalf of Colombian intellectuals and everyday folk.
Well, you know, I can't presume to say this book will have an immense influence. One hopes it will.
Right.
You know, when you say speak on behalf of the Colombian intellectuals, I'm actually a Colombian citizen, so I am a Colombian intellectual. Right, and the book is the characters in the book represent leading figures in the Colombian intelligentsia, if you will. The characters in the book. I mean, one of the things I try to do in my writing is get out of the way. In this book, which I think is, I don't know, what is it? Let's see how many pages.
300 and something.
Well, yeah, 400 pages. The word I appears 120 times. In other words, this is not my story, and to a great extent, I am simply a stenographer telling the stories of Colombian people. So in that sense, I don't presume to speak for the Colombian people, although now, in a sense, I'm entitled to do so because I've been embraced by them as a Colombian.
Question from Viting. Wade, what project are you working on now? What might we expect to see later? And this goes to a question I asked you earlier. Because people have said to me, so you've written a love letter to Colombia. When are you going to write a love letter to Canada?
I'm always very careful about speaking about future projects. I think when you write a book, you want to, it's kind of private, it's intimate, you know, and you have to be very careful not to dissipate the energy. I do have an idea for a book that would be exactly what you just said.
Okay.
And you know exactly what it is.
I know what you're talking about, but I won't share that.
Yeah, no.
But I think there's a good place to end, which I think we should do soon. And it goes to what you were just saying about characters in the book. You are known for, and I think to some degree revered for, some combination of the sort of lusciousness, but also the muscularity of your prose and your way of saying things that people like me wish they'd said or written, to be honest. And there's plenty of that in Magdalena. There's a lot of that in Magdalena, and I love what I read. But something else struck me in reading this, and it was actually how eloquent so many people are in the book. So many people, the characters in the book, the people you quote.
Yeah.
And there's a reference to an elder, an 88-year-old woman who was remembering the death of Gaitan, who was a presidential candidate back in 1948 or whenever that was, the 1940s. And she goes on to say, and this was a great Colombian hero for many people, you know, quote, "He's not really dead. His name is written in red letters across our hearts." And I thought to myself, you know, that's a kind of line that Wade Davis would write.
That's a quote. That's a quote from her. That's a quote from her.
That's a quote from her.
Well,
and what that signaled to me, and what I loved in this book, as I've loved in a lot of your work over the years, is not just the quality of your writing, but the quality of your listening. And it seems to me that in times like this, it's not just the writers, it's the listeners that we need to value in our society, and that actually the people who will help us understand, relate to each other, communicate with each other, and share the new narratives of hope, which is essentially what Magdalena is. You know, it's not journalism, it's not pure anthropology, it's actually a gift of hope to a country, and your ability to listen as well as write seems to be the greatest gift
You know, I think back to that previous question, I never presume to speak for the Colombians. I do everything I can to let them speak for themselves, and they do so, as you say, with great articulation. I mean, that Adelpha, who I just met in a cafe in the small mountain town of Murillo, also said God disappeared when Gaitan was killed. This was a very important assassination in 1948. But then she said, I was here when God returned. And what she was referring to is that that town is at the base, high on the mountain, but at the base of the Nevado de Ruiz, which erupted and sent 35 billion tons. I mean, and the entire mountain exploded, and Murillo should have been wiped out. And power went out, ash fell like snow, everybody was in the plaza, the priest was crying, people were waiting. In the darkness, mothers were reading the faces of their children like Braille to see if they were still with them. By all accounts, Adelpha stood like Magdalena and fearless. And she watched as the entire mountain went down on the other side of a ridge, skipping Murillo. And down valley, it would wipe out Armero and kill 35,000 people in a couple of hours. But that town was spared, and she said, that was the night when God came back to Murillo. And if I can just find one passage
to end on,
if I can find it. I can't. Ask me something else. Oh, I know. Oh no, here. Sorry, this will do it. I think I can find it. Yeah. This is a man called Herman Ferro, who wrote his PhD on the arrieros, the muleteers that carried all the goods on these narrow tracks, the narrow traffic. And he became the head of the Museum of the Rio Magdalena, the only institution totally dedicated to the river in a small colonial town of Onda. And I interviewed him, of course, we became friends. And one of the things I do in Colombia, when I never go on stage alone with this book. All the characters are on stage. It's like a dance, right? But this is what this is a straight quote. And by the way, the Rio Cauca is the other great affluent of the Magdalena, the parallel river that come together to form is the Rio Cauca. So he said, and this is straight off a tape recorder, "I'll never forget the moment when I first heard that the peace agreement had been signed in Havana. By chance, I was at the very confluence of the Rio Cauca and the Magdalena. I was completely overwhelmed by what I can only call geographical emotion, a sense of space, as if the spirits were emerging from the earth. I stripped off my clothes and placed my head in the river. As I stood in the sun, the water dripping down my naked body, I began to weep. Rivers of tears flowed as I realized that my son could grow up in a country at peace, a river that has known every tragedy, that has carried the dead and all the misery of the nation, that has suffered along with all Colombians, a river that I love so much. And there we were by its waters as peace came over the land." And this is just an interview in an office of a bureaucrat who happens to be Colombian. Colombians speak in full paragraphs, and they speak with poetry.
Wade, you listen in full paragraphs, and you listen and share your poetry. Thank you for doing that tonight. Thank you for joining us. I am at pains to tell you that Wade's book is out. It's published. It is magnificent. It is a true testament to his skill and also to the love he has for Colombia and for the river. It's a metaphor for
And what's the name of the best bookstore in Vancouver to find this book?
Oh, you mean Upstart and Crow on Granville Island, just around the corner? Thank you for that prompt. But honestly, any independent bookstore, please make sure it's an independent bookstore. A source of books should be carrying Wade's book. Please buy it. Please support Wade and his work. And to the question from Viting, what are you working on next? Stay tuned. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you to the Vancouver Writers Festival for hosting another magnificent event, or at least we hope it was for you. Thank you and good night.
Thank you very much.